Hello and welcome to Niaga Spotlight with me, Tamina Kaushi. Niaga Spotlight takes us through the week in economic analysis and future affairs. Now, this week on analysis, we discuss strengthening ASEAN-China economic ties. Well, as President Xi Jinping wraps up his three-nation ASEAN tour visiting Vietnam, Malaysia and Cambodia, he's not just signing memorandums of understanding, he's signing a manifesto for multilateralism. In a world where unilateral tariffs and trade wars are the new normal, Xi's message is clear: cooperation over coercion. Now, in Malaysia, the ink dried on 31 memorandums of understanding covering everything from green development to digital economy. That's not just a deal, that's a commitment to sustainable growth. Prime Minister Anwar Ibrahim, ever the pragmatist, emphasized that Malaysia's foreign policy will remain balanced and inclusive. He reaffirmed Malaysia's commitment to the One China policy and underscored the importance of ASEAN centrality in a shifting global order. Prime Minister Anwar's vision, a region where no nation, regardless of size, dictates the terms of engagement. Now, this visit, of course, comes on the heel of President Trump's Liberation Day tariffs and the subsequent 90-day suspension. While Washington plays chess, Beijing is playing bridge building, connections, not walls. In Cambodia, Xi's visit is a reminder that infrastructure is the backbone of economic diplomacy. Discussions centered around the $1.7 billion Funan Tico Canal project, with China poised to cover 49% of the cost. It's a partnership, not a bailout. So, as ASEAN prepares to chair the world stage, the message is unmistakable: unity, not division; collaboration, not confrontation. Now, in the grand tapestry of global politics, ASEAN and China are weaving a narrative of shared prosperity. Chin Duo-Su, senior fellow with Pangwal Institution, a Beijing-based think tank, joins me now online to weigh in on strengthening ASEAN-China economic ties. A very good morning. How are you doing, Chin Duo?
Thank you for having me. I'm good.
Fantastic. So let's get the discussion started, Chin Duo. I'd like to focus first by beginning on talking about beyond bilateralism, and can ASEAN-China economic integration lead to a new multilateral model? Perhaps a couple of thoughts on this to get the conversation going.
Thank you. Obviously, it is a very important task for a lot of countries to think about multilateralism or true multilateralism. It reminds me of the Munich Security Conference back in February in Germany. The United States senior officials at the meeting basically talked about their relationship with the European countries, and also their relationship with the world. It appears to be, more and more unilateral. That's a startling moment for the Europeans because they have a strong cross-Atlantic relationship. And then the Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi talked about, multilateralism in the sense of a true multilateralism, meaning that every member in the international community should be equitable. We are equal. We deal with each other on equal footing and with mutual respect. Respect for sovereignty, territorial integrity, internal affairs, respect for their own system. At the same time, we do cooperation in the manner of mutual benefits, in a mutual beneficial way. Otherwise, it will not be sustainable. You cannot have a relationship that benefits one side alone, at the expense of the benefits of the other side. Then that will not last long. So that's a very different, let's say, idea from the surface of the meaning. Like multilateralism means, okay, there are a lot of powers, a lot of poles. The U.S. is one pole, European Union, Russia, China, India, ASEAN, etc. It's not that sense. It's really about, yes, there are multilateral factors, but at the same time, what kind of relationship we want to have. That is a true multilateral or multipolarism means. And multilateral, on the other hand, is really, when it comes to trade, Windows WTO, World Trade Organization, that is an organization that regulates, trade between nations. So that means we have rules to follow for all the players. We have rules to follow. We are equal. If we have a dispute, if we have a problem, we know where to go, and we know there are rules that will measure whether our own behavior, whether our behavior or our policies are the right ones, are proper or not. And then we will accept that kind of a ruling. If we are wrong, and we will correct ourselves. If the other side is wrong, and we expect them to correct their own behavior. That is overall, I think, the international community looks forward to, instead of one that's unilateral with a strong sense of protectionism, like America first, and everything is about American interests, and they don't care about the interests of other partners. So that's why we are seeing this tension, this confrontation, this challenging moment with even the U.S. has with even its closest partners like Canada, like Mexico, like the European Union. So I think in this part of the world, China, ASEAN, the 10 ASEAN countries, in this region is the most dynamic economic growth. And I think, obviously people, I think it's not difficult for people somehow because of maybe Asian value, Asian culture. We understand this without much difficulty, and we conduct ourselves without much difficulty in handling with each other.
Clearly, the tone has been incredibly positive, and of course it helps to underscore the fact that bilateral trade between ASEAN and China reached a total volume of close to $912 billion in 2023 alone. Thanks for that, Chinduo. Now, moving along to looking at perhaps a digital Silk Road, perhaps versus a digital divide. And there is also a clear need to focus on navigating the digital economy when it comes to ASEAN-China relations. Now, both regions, of course, Chinduo, are investing heavily in our digital infrastructure. So how can we then ensure equitable access and avoid exacerbating the digital divide? This, of course, coming from the fact that across ASEAN, the rate of digitalization, of course, differs. Some thoughts on that?
Mm-hmm. Well, that's an important task. Internationally, when we talk about digital divide, usually we refer to some countries are in a leading position, other countries are lagging behind because of lack of technology transfer, lack of technology sharing with the poorer countries or less developed countries in that area. Inside the country, we often say, different regions because of economic reasons. Some regions are more advanced, others are less developed, and then there's a problem. I think inside the country, it's really about, we saw poverty alleviation or equality or equal access to internet, for example. Once people have the access to the internet, they, in particular the young people, will be able to figure out, what's the best technology I can access to, how can I use this technology for my purpose, for my business, and for my study, for example. So if you look at what's happening in Africa, that is the case. People also in China's case, China basically leap forward from you can say the diesel fueled cars, leap forward from its fixed phone line to mobile and to EV respectively. And in this sense, on the international platform, I would say it's about the technology sharing. For example, like let's say artificial intelligence. In the use of artificial intelligence, large language model, ChatGPT or DeepSeek is a bit different. ChatGPT is a commercial product. It's really about their purpose, obviously. The commercial commodity. Commercial body, entity, their purpose is profit, is to make money. DeepSeek, of course, is also a private entity in that sense, but its technology is open source. It is open source, meaning that everybody can access DeepSeek, and everybody can train in their own sphere of that expertise in their own technology area, and can train the large language model to work for their study, for their research. So many countries, many people are using DeepSeek. That's part of the sense. And then in the large sense, you can say that the Chinese side promotes the idea of sharing with its partners in terms of technology. China is ready to do technology transfer along Belt and Road Initiative, for example, partnership there, as long as that works for the partner side, for the country. And also, some people would call the Chinese modernization is an open source modernization. When China, let's say, get rid of the poverty and develop fast in terms of modernization, and it tries to share, what it has experienced and what worked and what it has to share with its partners. In this sense, of course, ASEAN countries like, artificial intelligence, digital technology. We are talking about, that's part of the 31 MOUs between China and Malaysia. It's also part of the cooperation between China and Vietnam, for example. So it's really about whether we are there with all the conditions, right or not, to work on the digital area, on artificial intelligence. I think that's the mind, the open-mindedness in terms of when it comes to partnership in this region.
Absolutely, and thank you also for raising the topic of DeepSeek, which of course leads to more digital autonomy and at the same time ensuring that data center investments, for example, are also done on a sustainable scaled model. At the same time, of course, ASEAN is also negotiating the Digital Economy Framework Agreement, DEFA, which hopes to unlock up to $2 trillion in digital economic value, and this over just the next 5 years or so by 2030. Thanks a lot for those insights, Chinduo. Let's move on into looking at, of course, green growth. Now, another topic, you can never let it go when you're talking about sustainability. Let's look at the fact that there are numerous green development projects which have been initiated. But however, what mechanisms could be put in place from your perspective to ensure their long-term environmental sustainabilities? And how can both parties, ASEAN as well as China, balance economic growth with environmental preservation in our collaborative efforts?
Well, it's a big question. That's a question, a topic for the global community, obviously. If you take a closer look at the Chinese development path in terms of green technology, it goes back at least 2 decades ago when China made plans to green its economy or for green development. The world, most of the world noticed very little about what's going on inside China. That is a long-term plan, probably because, during the certain point of industrialization, and every nation will experience this heavy, serious pollution, air pollution, water pollution, soil pollution, and you have to deal with that problem. And that is a serious challenge for the Chinese side. At one point, the number one priority for the Chinese public is pollution, air pollution. So the government has to, work hard to deal with that issue. That's part of the reason why China stresses so much about green technology, green energy, or green development. Politically, the Chinese leadership, they talked about ecological civilization. That is, I would say, the upgraded the issue of being green to a level of civilization. So that's how much importance they attach to this topic. And then, that's one part. Another part, of course, China is a part of this, important part of this global efforts against climate change. So I think, somehow they worked very well. And, internationally, that's your responsibility. There's your commitment to reduce carbon dioxide. And inside, of course, you deal with pollution. And then Chinese invest heavily in this sector. And then with technology and with a lot of investment, you do have technology. You have a market. You have competition. So that's why we are seeing this rapid EV rise in China. Currently, there are more than about 130 companies in the EV sector. There's a fierce competition. Competition brings better service, lower price, and high quality products there. So that's, of course, in the green energy sector, China is the leading in the world, solar panel, batteries, etc. So in this sense, China has a lot to offer, has a lot to share with its ASEAN partners, either in EV sector, solar panel, batteries. China can work, both sides can work together to have battery, for example, factories, if it suits the condition, the necessary condition. And then there's a growing supply chain, I would say, supply chain between China and ASEAN countries that will be bringing the two sides much more integrated in this sector. And of course, China alone will not do that. ASEAN alone will not do that. We have to work together to fight climate change, to have a sustainable development. We will push forward for better green technologies and to make our development sustainable, our environment sustainable, or better protected. I think that's the way to go. There's basically no disputes about that, maybe except for the MAGA people in some part of in the United States. Some people still deny climate change. That's a different story. But in the rest of the world, people are committed to fighting climate change, committed to better environment, committed to sustainable development. And in this sector, I think there's government-to-government cooperation from the Chinese side to Malaysia to ASEAN side, and then there's a private sector cooperation, firms from the Chinese side and business leaders from Malaysia, from ASEAN countries. They needed to, and they are doing that actually, meet each other frequently, talk to each other in an intensive manner to see how we can work together to offer better products that will protect the environment, that will ensure long-term development, that will ensure that less and less pollution, less and less waste in terms of manufacturing, in terms of serving communities.
Certainly, and of course it bears repeating that quantifiably so, China's investments over the years 2000 to 2020 across ASEAN for renewable energy efforts exceeded about $31 trillion. So that is definitely very important. And moving from there into supply chain resilience, Trinjo, do you feel that ASEAN-China cooperation will be able to mitigate global trade disruptions, given of course the recent challenges in global supply chains? And how can we move towards enhancing cooperation to build a more resilient and diversified supply chain? Perhaps we could discuss a little more on the Belt and Road play and how these initiatives come in for this context.
Yes, I think it has different aspects. On one hand, resilient global supply chain. It requires, of course, infrastructure and connectivity. Physical infrastructure, you want to have better roads, highways, ports, and then I would call it, let's say, non-tangible connectivity or infrastructure, financial infrastructure, for example, or digital infrastructure, etc. That's very important for connectivity inside the country and also in the region, or in this sense, China and ASEAN countries. That's connectivity. Infrastructure resilient. Why we are talking about that? Partly because of the pandemic, partly because of this geopolitical tension. Somehow some countries decided to reroute their supply chain or rewrite supply chain. So-called friend-shoring or near-shoring. That's a change of global supply chain. It brings disruption, unfortunately, to the global community. And then for countries that are concentrate on free trade and multilateralism, so they are talking about resilience of global supply chain or of regional supply chain, either way. And then in this sense, China and ASEAN is, I think, global supply chain, of course, you have one place that's the starting point, and then there's an end place, probably you can call it consumption market. Currently, there's probably, in a sense, there's heavy reliance, I'll call it over-dependence on the U.S. market, our final product. Chinese final product, Vietnamese final product, etc., ASEAN countries, the final product often lands in the U.S. market. That gives the U.S., of course, a lot of power. They have the consumption power. Give them the power to impose tariffs on countries like China, like ASEAN, Cambodia, Vietnam, in this part of the world, Japan, South Korea, basically every country, Australia, etc. or Singapore, despite the U.S. The fact the U.S. enjoys trade surplus with Singapore, with Australia, they still impose 10% tariffs. But anyway, I think the idea of resilience here, in one way, is really about increase our own power of consumption, grow our own market inside this region, China and ASEAN. On the Chinese side, of course, China has made it a priority to boost domestic consumption, not only consumption of Chinese goods, but also consumption from other parts of the world. That's we call it import, of course, in terms of trade. We purchase products from Malaysia, from Vietnam, from ASEAN countries, agricultural products, and other kinds of products, of course. And this, and then there's the idea of the region-wide consumption increase. For example, inside ASEAN countries, 10 countries, I think the focus should not only be on the ability to manufacture, to make stuff, to make goods, but also the ability, people's ability to consume we call it like this level of consumption, or in that sense, that intra relationship that is countries should work together to do more trade with each other, to consume goods and services from each other. And in this sense, China and ASEAN, we should trade more goods within our partnership, and we should consume more services within this relationship. For example, more students from ASEAN countries go to China to pursue their further studies with digital technology, with artificial intelligence, with quantum computing, etc. China is probably one of the two countries leading in these sectors. And then Chinese tourists, we see last year, for example, 2024, witnessed almost about 6 million visits between Malaysia and China. So that's an increase. And if you look at the public perception of each other, obviously, it's very positive. The sentiment is very positive. There's a lot of young people in the Chinese side. On the Chinese side, they want to go to Malaysia, go to ASEAN countries to visit, to study, in particular in Malaysia. And it's the same, on the Malaysian side, on ASEAN side. So that's a purchase of service, right? Education is part of service. Tourism is part of service economy. So in that sense, we will reduce our reliance on the U.S. market, for example. In that sense, and then that's the resilience of supply chain, and because you reduce your reliance on the outside destination, and then you increase your own level of consumption. And so, of course, by strengthening relationship, by having partnership in the manufacturing sector, and of course, that's the resilience of global supply chain.
Clearly. And also BRI initiatives have of late been focusing on human capital development, which is most helpful, especially for countries like Cambodia and Myanmar, focusing on vocational skills as well as equipping the workforce with regional industrial knowledge. So moving on from there into geopolitical tensions, Chinduo. Now, how could ASEAN-China economic relations navigate regional security concerns? This is, of course, in light of ongoing geopolitical tensions, particularly in the South China Sea. So any preliminary thoughts on that?
That's a good question, a very important question, because without stability, without peace, there's no development. I think that's the common understanding in this region between China and ASEAN countries in particular. Obviously, most of the ASEAN countries, because we know that there's dispute between China and the Philippines ongoing. And if you look at the majority of the countries, absolute majority of countries in this region, including China, their national priority is development. It's the same for us, for Malaysia. It's the same for Vietnam, the same for Indonesia, for Singapore, because we know that we need to develop it further for the welfare of our people, for the benefit interest of our nation. So that's the understanding. That's why this region is the most dynamic in terms of economic expansion. It's a locomotive of the global economy. For example, China alone contributes every year 30% of global economic growth. So we are the important contributor to the global economic growth. But the prerequisite, of course, for that kind of contribution, for that kind of growth, is regional peace and stability. For that purpose, I would say important factor is, on one hand, we should always stick to our traditional practice, respect for domestic affairs. For example, the one China policy. ASEAN countries, they respect the one China policy. Without change in that policy, because I'm saying this because some Western countries tried to make some changes over that policy. That's very unfortunate because that's the fundamental interest of the Chinese side. If any country that play with that concept, play with that the Taiwan question, that creates instability, that creates tension. And in this part of the world, fortunately, I think there's wise wisdom among ASEAN countries. Every country basically respects faithfully, implement faithfully the one China policy, one China principle.
So to interrupt you over there, Kinduo, so clearly to summarize all of that, ASEAN and China are moving towards ensuring that economic relations remain unaffected by security issues. Thank you so very much for your time and your fantastic insights. It's been an absolute pleasure having you on Niaga Spotlight. Well, that's all we have time for today. That was Kinduo Xu, who is a senior fellow with Pangol Institution, a Beijing-based think tank discussing strengthening ASEAN-China economic ties. I'm Tamina Kowski signing off for now. We'll see you again with Niaga Spotlight next round with more economic analysis and issues.